Hey everyone, Chris Carter here from the North Shore Drive podcast here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We've got Ray Fittipaldo on today, and I want to talk about what my point was when I did my article about why DK Metcalf can be a better wide receiver one than George Pickens was for the Steelers. We'll talk about that. Ray's article in 2022 draft class, what the Steelers have to learn from that, and a look at how the Steelers can survive their end-of-season gauntlet better this season than they did last season. All here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive Podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm Chris Carter. He's Ray Fittipaldo. We're your Steelers writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, you can find us here on the North Shore Drive podcast every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel to get all of those episodes, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this episode is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Not only will they help you if you're injured in an accident, they'll also help you with your workers' compensation rights. Be sure to call them today at Edgar Snyder Associates at 1-800-94-EDGAR. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, we're going to start with DK Metcalf, because he's a big factor into everything the Steelers are trying to do with this offense this year. They traded a second-round pick away to get him. Then they trade away George Pickens for a third-round pick, essentially swapping receivers and moving down a pick with that selection. When I looked at the tape, and I wrote about this in the Post-Gazette over the weekend, you can check it out at Post-Gazette.com. One of the big things that I noticed, Ray, was that DK Metcalf, he doesn't have better hands than George Pickens. I think that's one of the things George Pickens has that's on an elite level that like just is insane about him, the grabs that he has. But what he does is he follows through in so many other parts of the game that it not only makes up for that, it makes him better than what George was. He'll run all of his routes. He'll run his full route tree. And even if he's not the sharpest all the time, he's putting that effort in every single play. And that's something that really does make a difference when you're looking at a play-by-play basis and having a more complete offense.
Yeah, and blocking in the running game as well, which a guy of DK size certainly should excel in Arthur Smith's offense. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Just being that quarterback's best friend, right? Being in the right place at the right time when you're supposed to be. We all know that didn't always happen with George Pickens. And, George can certainly provide some big plays on an occasion for you, but it was never really consistent with him. He was always around, 800, 900 yards, never really produced a ton of touchdowns for you. He only had, 3 last year? So Calvin Austin led the Steelers with 4 touchdowns. That should never happen. So I understand there were other circumstances involved there, quarterback play, but George never really helped himself and did the little things that you need to do to succeed. DK, which I think is one of the biggest reasons they went out and got him, he's a pro, and he's going to have a professional approach, and he's going to be, that reliable receiver that a quarterback wants, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, Mason Rudolph, whoever happens to be behind center in 2025.
The most touchdowns George Pickens has had in the season so far in his 3-year career is 5. In 2023, he had that. That's the lowest amount of touchdowns DK Metcalf has had in the season with 5. He's had as high as 12 or 10 in some of his past years. And you can say, hey, quarterback play plays a factor in there, and sure it does. But part of it is he works with whoever his quarterback is, whether it's Russell Wilson or Geno Smith. He's a guy that's working through different things, and he still does bring the deep threat. When I look at the amount of catches or the amount of catches and targets that the receivers had in 2024 on deep passes, George Pickens led the NFL with 17 catches when the ball was targeted 20 yards or more downfield. DK Metcalf is right behind him with 16 such catches. And so he can be that guy that can be a deep threat, but he also does the other things. And like I highlighted different plays, one actually specifically against the Steelers 2 years ago when they were playing him, and he got over 100 yards against them. And he was doing a lot of the little things in that game. An example that I put in this article is there was a play where Joey Porter Jr. did a really good job kind of running with DK Metcalf initially. He anticipated his route, cut him off to the middle, and his route was kind of dead. And the play there were a lot of times where if you cut off George Pickens' route initially, that was it. He'd kind of just stand there and he just kind of like, well, throw me the ball or, make something else up. But instead, DK Metcalf kind of looks behind him. He sees the lone safety back behind Joey Porter is Patrick Peterson, and he's in the middle part of the field. So DK Metcalf says, you know what? I'm going to break towards the sideline and keep going deeper. And so that Joey Porter Jr. is going to have to chase me. And Joey Porter Jr. thinks that he has safety help behind him. The safety help's in the middle part of the field. That's a soft spot in the zone. And DK Metcalf gets open, and Geno Smith finds him for a big completion. And then that's just an example of constantly working plays, not giving up on plays. And also when the play's not going your way, not half-heartedly running your routes, because then cornerbacks and defensive backs, when they see that, oh, he's not running hard on this play, it's not coming this way, we're fine here. But like I saw plays where he was working Christian Gonzalez, who's a second-team All-Pro corner, and getting open against him on plays that were designed to go the opposite way. It's all those little things that do end up making a difference, and those are the things the Steelers were trying to get George Pickens to do that he just never locked in on, consistent about.
Yeah, never giving up on a play, always trying to work to get open to help out your quarterback. DK Metcalf, is going to be good in that regard for the Steelers. Just a little sidebar to this conversation. Mm-hmm. I really do think at some point, Chris, and I know DK and Aaron Rodgers worked out at least once that we know of, but that kind of chemistry, right? Like knowing, okay, I'm covered, but I'm going to break this way. That's the type of stuff that you have to get down with your quarterback at some point during this offseason. I'm not saying it has to take place during OTAs or even mini camp, but whoever the quarterback is, they're going to have to spend a lot of time with DK Metcalf because he is new. And even if it's Mason Rudolph, right? Like Aaron's going to have to do that with every Steelers receiver. Mason has some experience, but really with who? Just Calvin Austin, right? Because
Wilson didn't play.
Roman Wilson was a rookie last year when Mason was in Tennessee. So regardless of who the signal caller for the Steelers is, those receivers are going to have to work constantly with them. And I wouldn't be surprised if, we hear about, these receivers going for a week, 10 days, late June, early July, work with Mason, work with Aaron Rodgers, just so they can work on that kind of stuff and, just get on the same page because it's vitally important, to secondary offense. If the play call doesn't work, the play's not dead. You still have to find a way to make something happen. And those are the types of situations where Aaron Rodgers and DK Metcalf and all of his receivers are going to have to, do a good job and spend a lot of time together.
Chemistry is a huge part of it, and it takes time to build that, which is another reason why everyone's wondering when Aaron Rodgers is going to show up. Will he show up for OTAs? That starts next week. Will he show up for mandatory minicamp? That's in a few weeks. That's still a big question to have, and that's a time where you could be getting yourself more familiar with the Steelers offense. We're going to take a quick break. We come back. I want to look back at the end of the Steelers schedule. It was released last Wednesday. I got a chance to talk with Brian about it on Friday, but I want to talk to Ray about the end of the season stretch there, because that end of the season looks a lot familiar to the gauntlet that they went through last year, where they lost 4 straight games heading into the playoffs and fell from 10-3 to 10-7 and then lost the first round of the playoffs. How can they do better against this stretch of a gauntlet? We'll talk about that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder and Associates. If you ever need help with workers' compensation, Edgar Snyder and Associates has got your back. When you've been hurt on the job, you need to know who decides when you're better, who decides when your treatment's over, and who decides when your benefits are over. The problem is it's the insurance company's doctors who decide all of that. They won't be on your side. Edgar Snyder and Associates will. If the answer that you need is getting help for that, call Edgar Snyder and Associates today, 1-800-94-EDGAR, because they'll fight for the workers' compensation rights that you deserve. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, Let's talk about an article that you wrote when you were talking about the 2022 draft class and what lessons have been, have been learned there. When you look back at that draft class, you have Kenny Pickett was the first round pick at 20th overall. George Pickens was the second round pick at 52. You got DeMarvin Leal at the third round pick. Fourth round was Calvin Austin the third. Sixth round was Connor Hayward, and then seventh round picks Mark Robinson and Chris Oladokun. Of course, the only guys left right now are Leal, Austin, Hayward, and Robinson. Pickett, traded away. Pickens traded away. Oladokun's been gone since his rookie season. Yeah. What's the biggest lesson that you have to learn, or the Steelers should learn from Kevin Colbert's final draft class?
I think there's two, and I really go back and forth on which is more important. But Chris, you could never reach for a quarterback, especially when it's a bad year for quarterbacks, and that was almost an historically bad year. We'll see how 2025 shapes up, but 2022 arguably was the worst quarterbacks class in 2 decades or so for the NFL. And they thought they had their guy, they saw him next door. Maybe that whole deal of like, okay, we think we know this person, but maybe there should have been more consideration given to either the other quarterbacks in that draft, or just passing on those quarterbacks entirely and just going for a stopgap measure, which they've obviously been doing the last couple of years. And then when you look at Pickens, I think Mike Tomlin kind of fell in love with this, after he had a lot of success with Antonio Brown. Just manage the personality, you'll get great results. But even in the end, Chris, you saw that he was more of a problem than he was worth. And with George Pickens, it never really even got to that point. I mean, he almost was never worth a problem. He never helped you win, put up some decent numbers. But I guess the point of the story is when there are red flags with prospects coming out, you better do your homework. And if you're not sure you can handle that type of personality, the best thing to do is probably just take them off your board.
I think that's certainly a lesson there. I want to hover back to the quarterback point, because that's something that you and I were kind of banging the table about this draft class. And you said we still got to figure out what it is, because I think this draft class at least had a Cam Ward who was a bona fide. Everyone agreed, like, hey, that guy's going first overall. Kenny Pickett was the first quarterback, taken off the board at 20th overall when the Steelers took him. But I think that year, a lot of people were talking like he probably was going to be a third round pick if the Steelers didn't take him, just like how a lot of people were clamoring for Shedeur Sanders to be the Steelers' first round pick, and he went in the 5th this year. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like, a big lesson is don't reach for quarterback. If you believe that guys, if you're ranking guys where they are, and that's another thing. We don't know for sure where Kenny Pickett was on the Steelers draft board and everything, and how they ranked him exactly. Maybe they did, feel like, hey, he's further down our list, but we really need a quarterback right now. Let's go get him. But if that was the case, they did that is certainly a cardinal sin that they cannot afford to repeat. And that's what they're trying to do right now, I think, by drafting the pieces that they have year after year. And I know there's people out there that say you just got to draft a quarterback. You got to keep swinging until you're out of swings, and until you find one. And so, but I look around and I say, like, look, if they do that, they miss, and they finally do get the quarterback on their 4th swing, but yeah. They've missed that. They've missed out on keeping up the D line, building up an offensive line. Yeah. Then when you get the quarterback, you're not going to be ready to win when you finally have him on your roster.
But that's why it's okay for a Will Howard to come in the 6th round, right? You address all of your other needs.
Exactly.
D line was an obvious one, so was running back, and they went for value in the 4th. So I thought, you could take your swings, but just take them later in the draft. You never really know how it's going to work out. And you can win in the NFL. You might not get to the playoffs or be a team that can compete in the playoffs. But if you got a great roster and you got a quarterback who can manage things, not put the ball in harm's way, feed his skill position players and run the offense in an efficient manner, you could be a good football team. But eventually, you're right, you are going to have to go out and spend some of your resources and get that quarterback, Chris. And I would just much rather do it when my roster is built and I'm ready to win, rather than just taking swings early and then, doing it at the expense of, building from the trenches out, or, bolstering some other positions. So I know Omar Khan was in the front office for Kevin Colbert's last draft in 22. He wasn't making the picks. Maybe the biggest lesson of all is Omar really learned from that last draft. Hey, we're not going to take a quarterback this year. We're going to make sure that our roster is ready to win. So when we do get a quarterback, we can hit the ground running.
No, I think that's certainly part of it. You look at what happened there and how it played out. The Steelers seem to have taken that lesson moving forward. And I always like to try to use history to compare to things and what you could have done. When the Steelers, I look back at the 2003 NFL draft when the Steelers had Tommy Maddox, and like everyone's like, I don't know if he's the long-term answer. And in the 2003 draft, before Ben Roethlisberger, they draft Troy Polamalu. They trade up to pick Troy Polamalu. Hall of Fame safety, one of the greatest players of all time, one of the greatest Steelers of all time, amazing pick. And without him, they don't win any of those Super Bowls in the 2000s.
Right.
What if that was the year where they had reached a quarterback? Well, the next quarterback off the board was Rex Grossman. You pick Rex Grossman, probably don't pick Ben Roethlisberger, and you probably don't get you definitely don't get Troy Polamalu. And that ruins the entire run there. And there's probably still just 4 Super Bowls in Pittsburgh. And everyone's wondering about, the good old days of the 70s. And again, like that's a very specific one-time example, but it's about making sure that you take your shot. And listen, you're still going to miss at times, right? Not every quarterback draft pick works out. As I pointed out many times, the only first-round quarterback selected since the Ben Roethlisberger, Eli Manning draft that has won a Super Bowl for the team that drafted him, it's still Patrick Mahomes. So, looking at that, I think it's just like, hey, acknowledging there's got to be patience there, but the patience has to be twofold. Patience on waiting for that quarterback to develop and waiting for them to be there, but patience in saying, like, hey, we can be okay drafting these position players and continuing to make this overall roster stronger.
Well, going back and looking at history the way you did kind of makes my original point, right? Like Rex Grossman got to a Super Bowl, but Rex Grossman wasn't the reason the Chicago Bears got to the Super Bowl, right? They had the roster built up around him. And if he was drafted in 2003, I think they made it, 3 years later? I think they were there in 2006 against the Colts. So that roster was ready to win. Those were some great Bears teams led by Urlacher, a great defense. But they were never able to get over the hump. And why? They never had the quarterback. So, I agree with you. It's great to look back sometimes and sort of look at how, the ways things unfolded. And I think that's a great example of a team drafting a quarterback that wasn't good enough to win you a Super Bowl, but he was good enough to get you there.
And a quick note on the other point that you made about, talking, picking players that have red flags on them. Maybe the Steelers, took swings at that because they felt they had the nucleus over the years to handle that. I feel like every team has a malcontent at some point in time, right? Like the Eagles just won a Super Bowl championship. A.J. Brown was reading a book on the sideline when he felt like he wasn't getting targeted enough. And so there were in the news, it was public that he was going after Nick Sirianni in the locker room and things like that. Things were not all peaches and sunshine and rainbows in Philadelphia all year long with their receiver room. But because they have a core of players that is so strong, I think that, and they were winning, it overshadows that. And sometimes you deal with that. And that's where I think that the Steelers, if they're going to take on other players like that again, they need the leadership structure on both sides of the ball to handle it. Because, you remember in the days when they had even just Marquise Pouncey, David DeCastro along there with Ben Roethlisberger, you could get in the face of guys like Juju Smith-Schuster or Chase Claypool. You had enforcers who could set the tone and say, like, no, that's not how we do things. This is how we do things. And I think that's the other thing here is that there will come a time when the Steelers draft a guy that has, character questions and, does he get in trouble off the field and things like that. That happens to it's almost unavoidable in football, but it's having the leadership structure in place to say, hey, you're not coming into an organization feeling like you're the stuff. George Pickens knew he was the best receiver on the team last year and maybe even the best player on the offense. But when you have the leadership structure in place that when a guy like that arrives, you can say, I don't care how good you are, you're going to play our way and you're going to follow our rules. That's the kind of stuff that can help you survive when you have those type of guys on your roster.
And winning does mask a lot of things. Look at the season in between the Eagles' 2 Super Bowl appearances, right? There was a lot of drama that year because they weren't winning, and it kind of bubbled to the surface. And It did bubble to the surface this year, but they had the leadership to overcome that. And then you can go back and look at the Steelers. I know they never got to a Super Bowl like in that 14, 15, 16, 17 stretch, but a lot of that stuff with Antonio was swept under the rug because they were in the playoffs every year. They were putting up monster numbers on offense, and they were winning a lot of football games. And then what happens in 2018? Everything just kind of comes to a head because things had just run its course. So that's a great point, I think, and especially with receivers, Chris. You're probably going to have to take a risk on a receiver at some point because they all seem to be the same nowadays. Like they're all kind of growing up in this 7-on-7 culture, and it's all about them. But to me, when I look back at George, that seems like there were bright red flags that they decided to ignore. You could have some red flags, but if your scouts and your coaches do your homework and understand the situation, maybe there are guys that you can maybe take a gamble on. But looking back, I think George Pickens had too much in his past, and it probably wasn't smart to take him there.
Absolutely. When we come back, I want to talk about that end of the Steelers schedule because it looks like there could be another gauntlet on their hands. Can they handle this one better than they did last year, and how would they do that? That's next here on the North Shore Drive podcast. But first, I want to remind you, this show is also brought to you by UFC Gym Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a way to challenge your body and sharpen your mind, step into something more than just a workout. Welcome to the brand new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy at UFC Gym. Here, it's not just about training, it's about living the values of honor, discipline, and respect. Whether you're a total beginner or leveling up your skills, you'll be guided through a structured program led by third-degree black belts that builds confidence, strength, flexibility, and real technique. Head down to the UFC Gym in Pittsburgh at the Waterfront or Market Square to learn about the exclusive 3-month introductory package today. That's UFC Gym Pittsburgh. Welcome back here to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about this end of the season schedule now. Last year, of course, the Steelers had a gauntlet where they went through the Ravens, the Eagles, the Chiefs, and then ended up with the Bengals, who were the only non-playoff team. But if there was a non-playoff team to face that was tough that year last year, it was the Bengals with Joe Burrow. But that stretch of run that they had there kind of just took the air out of their sails, and they went from a 10-3 team that was right in the thick of winning the division, maybe even getting a 1 seed in the playoffs, and then fell off a cliff. This year, they do have a tough schedule. I don't think there's any real super soft spots. There's some teams I think are certainly beatable on their schedule, but when they get through week 12, they're going to be in a position where in the final 6 weeks of the season, in week 13, they're at home against the Buffalo Bills, a heavy Super Bowl favorite with Josh Allen. They're on the road the week after that in Baltimore. We know that the Ravens, how well they did against them late last season. Then they're back at home against the Dolphins. There's a more favorable matchup, a team that hasn't really done that well of late, and they struggle typically in December in cold weather. But then the week after that, you're back on the road against the Lions in Detroit, and the Lions are another Super Bowl favorite. Then the week after that, you're at the Browns, where the Steelers haven't won since 2017, and then you finish the year at at home against the Ravens. Now, that could be the week that if the Ravens are winning the division, that they bench their guys. But even so, that's a run of 4 Super Bowl contending teams in 6 weeks at the end of the season. Ray, what's the biggest thing the Steelers have to achieve to make sure that they don't go through that stretch 0-4 like they did this end of this past year, 0-4?
Yeah, I think the competition is just as good over that final stretch. The only difference is you're not playing 3 of those games in 11 days, which I think looking back, Chris, that probably I know other teams dealt with it, but things just kind of snowballed on the Steelers. If you remember, there was a lot of infighting defensively with communication. It's hard to practice that stuff when you're only on the field once or twice, in between those games, and you're walking through a lot of stuff. So, that was a big issue. And honestly, what can they do? To avoid that again. I mean, it's just a lot of it is quarterback play, right? I mean, Russell Wilson wasn't playing well down the stretch. Listen, if you have a guy like Aaron Rodgers, I think you're probably going to be better equipped to maybe, get through a stretch like that where you're not going 0-5, and maybe you do hit a slump, but maybe you find a way to win 2 of those games, right? Or maybe you're just 3-3 in that final stretch, and you'd still be in good position to maybe make a playoff run. So, first the Steelers got to get there. They do have to take advantage of what I think is an easier portion of the schedule in the first 2 months of the season. Then if they could do that, I honestly believe if Aaron Rodgers is healthy and he's playing well, he'd be able to overcome some of the things that they faced late in the season in 2024.
I think Aaron Rodgers definitely is a big factor there because Russell Wilson certainly struggled in a fair share of those games. You think of the fumble in the red zone against the Ravens, the pick 6 he threw in that same game, the struggles he had against the Eagles offense, the interception he threw in the end zone against the Chiefs, and then just the overall struggles that the offense went against the Bengals with. It certainly could be a factor there. But another factor I also think could play in, Ray, is this offensive line needs to actually take a step forward at some point this year. If this offensive line is run blocking well, pass protecting well, giving Aaron Rodgers time, but also letting the run game be the factor late in the season, that's what this team's supposed to be, right? Like, we've been talking about their investments in the O-line between Broderick Jones, Troy Fautanu, Zach Frazier, Mason McCormick, and they still have Isaac Seumalo as a vet on that side, on that unit. If that unit is able to run the ball late in the season, it takes the pressure off of how much Aaron Rodgers actually has to do with DK Metcalf, Calvin Austin, and company. They need to be able to have that as a factor in those games. They didn't have it as a factor in those games late. They couldn't run the ball in really any of those 4 teams, and that put Russell Wilson in the offense in a tough situation. If you get that part of the game going, it makes if it's Aaron Rodgers, Mason Rudolph, whoever's the quarterback, that much easier. And that'll be something the Steelers haven't had late in the season, I think, since maybe even the Le'Veon Bell days. Because when you think back to even when they still had Pouncey and DeCastro, they weren't that physically run dominant team that could just grind you out when they really wanted to. And that's something that won them. In fact, that's the last time that they won a playoff game was when Le'Veon Bell was able to run for like 200 yards against the Chiefs, and they were just able to trust that O-line to move people. I think that'll be the big factor. If they're able to pull it off and beat and beat some of these teams at the end of the season, it'll be the run game that's the biggest change that gets them going.
Yeah, I mean, people remember the Super Bowl because it was a blowout and because the Eagles were so explosive. They were actually really explosive throughout their playoff run. But Chris, if you look back at them during the regular season, what's the one thing you remember about that Steelers-Eagles game in Philadelphia?
Just getting run over.
Yeah, the 11-minute drive to close out the game, right? Where they did. Yeah, they ran 11 minutes. That's a Super Bowl drive. You could have all the explosive plays that you want, and you need some. But when you have the ability to grind an opponent into the ground and to keep the ball for almost a quarter against a good defense too. I mean, that to me was who the Eagles were last year. And yeah, Barkley broke long runs in the playoffs, and obviously he's the best running back in the NFL. He's got a great offensive line too, but running game is such an important thing. And I think the Steelers are going to need some explosive plays this year, but I think to your point, yes, they need a good running game. They need that offensive line to step up, to take off the pressure off whoever is behind center for the Steelers, whether that's Aaron Rodgers, Will Howard, Mason Rudolph, whoever you want that to be.
There you have it. He's Ray Fittipaldo. I'm Chris Carter. We're your Steelers writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Be sure to subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com, and be sure to subscribe to the North Shore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's podcasting network on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of this show and all of the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Back Wednesday with more here on the North Shore Drive podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.